Hey ladies, welcome to week 4, study of the Gospel of John. We are looking at so what? What difference does Jesus really make in our life? And today we are going to be studying through the chapters of chapter 5, 6, and then a tiny bit of 7. So one of my earliest memories is the smell of baking bread. So my parents, when I was right around when I was born, decided that they were going to go live off the land, and they moved to Montana. They wanted living off the land. For those of you who are now, we're millennials in the new millennium, this is kind of like homesteading these days. So they kind of moved out there, and my mom would actually grind her own grain. She did have a KitchenAid food processor, but she would grind her own grain and make bread. And so the smell of bread kind of reminds me of a simpler time of life. When you think of your childhood, your life is guided by one very simple rule. Mom and dad are in charge. They're just in charge. They decide when you sleep, your sleep schedule. Mom kind of organizes your day, when you wake up, when you take a nap, when you go to bed. Mom decides when you eat. She decides, what you're going to eat. She puts it in front of you and says, this is mealtime. Mom also decides how you can be safe, when you're afraid. Mom and dad are the ones that you go to when you're afraid. And then they also kind of decide what your chores are. What are the rules that govern your life? This is what childhood is all about, is about you kind of not having a lot of responsibility or control over your own life. And then we all start to grow up, and we begin to make choices that maybe are different than what our mom and dad would have chosen for us. We can decide that we're going to stay up maybe a little bit later, that we're going to eat things that mom and dad maybe wouldn't choose for us to eat. We put ourselves in situations where we're afraid, and we have different things that we lean on to make us not afraid. And this is where a lot of us make a big mistake. We think that because mom and dad are no longer the ones in charge of us, that means that we're now the ones that are in charge. We're the ones that are in control of us. But the beauty of a family is that mom and dad were never really the ones who were ultimately in control. They were just God's agents. They were God's ambassadors. And God was always in control of our lives. And in a healthy family, in healthy parenting, parents will move out of the way. They will no longer stand in between their child and God. And so a child, as they grow, can start to feel God's direct control on their life, that they don't feel God's control expressed through their parents. And like I said, so many of us have bought into the lie that we are in control of our own lives, that we're the ones that get to make the choices, and that it's actually not God. But John points out to us that ultimately it is God who has the right and is the authority in our life. And he is the one who decides all of the same things that our parents decided for us, that it's him. And when we submit to his control is when we can have life, and we can have life to the full. So we are going to go ahead and walk through these 3 chapters of John. And these chapters, they deal with all that basic stuff that I just talked about. They deal with rest. They deal with hunger. They deal with fear. They deal with boundaries and rules that we'll see in each of these chapters. So there are 4 main stories that we're going to look at. And each of these stories, interestingly enough, happened during a major religious observance or holiday. So the first one we're going to look at is the story of the healing of the lame man by the pool in John 5, and that is during a Sabbath day, so one of the religious holy days. Then the story of the feeding of the 5,000 and the story of Jesus walking on water all happened in the context of Passover. And then the last story that we're going to talk about is the story of the adulterous woman. And that happens during another feast that we think is probably the Feast of Tabernacles, which celebrates the Jews' wilderness wanderings. And these holidays or holy days are really an aspect of religion. And religion is about man trying to draw close to God. Faith is about God drawing close to us. I like to think of the picture of the Sistine Chapel of Adam and God. And you see Adam kind of leaning back in repose, and God and all of heaven is straining towards him. And I think that that's the picture that we get of faith, is that God is straining everything towards us. And all we have to do is kind of move our finger, and he's right there for us. God does give us rites and observances and holy days so that we can put ourselves in a place where he can reach us. They're not something that we do to get ourselves to God. They're something that kind of take away some of the hindrances that would stand in the way of God getting to us. So we're going to start out with John 5, 1 through 14. And I'm going to go ahead and just read. I'm not going to read all 3 chapters, but I'm going to read these stories. So John 5, 1 through 14. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool which in Aramaic is called Bethsaida, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, and the paralyzed. The one who was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and he walked. The day on which this took place was the Sabbath. And so the Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." So I want you to notice a couple things about this. First off, I want you to notice that this man was not looking for Jesus to solve his problem. Jesus was in town. He was a miracle worker. People knew he was there. But this man decided in the face of that to go back to the same thing that he had been trying. So this is a superstition that he had. It was actually a really well-known superstition of the time. It's even written about in Greek literature that this specific pool had some sort of like an angel that when the waters were stirred, people could get healed. And, we don't know if it was like a wind that did it, but it was a superstition. And he had been trying this same superstition. We don't know for how long, but it seemed like for a very long time. And it hadn't been working for him. And he didn't have any idea who Jesus was. Jesus is the one who does all of the work in this passage. He comes to the man. He finds him at the well. He rouses in him a desire to change, to recognize that what the path that he's chosen isn't working for him. And then he heals him. And all the man has to do is admit that what he had been doing wasn't working, and then he just has to stand up. It's not even like a step of faith. It's just, he's been healed. Now move on. Move on. And the Pharisees are really mad about this. They're mad because this man, the first thing that they notice is not that the man has been healed, but that this man is not resting on the day of rest. Okay, so this is the Sabbath day. And the law says that you cannot carry anything on the Sabbath. Now, the Pharisees had made all of these laws around the law, okay? So the law was that God's law was that the Sabbath was a day for resting. Now, in order to make sure that they understood exactly how to follow the law, the Pharisees had made these rules. And so they said, okay, well, if you carry something on the Sabbath, then that's not resting. But if you're wearing something on the Sabbath, then that is resting. That's just wearing clothing. So if this man had like made a backpack of his mat and he was walking with it, then that wouldn't have been breaking the Sabbath. They had other ridiculous rules, like you couldn't do medical work on the Sabbath, and so they, like at the time, like they would put vinegar on their teeth to cure a toothache, so you couldn't do that on the Sabbath. Sabbath, but you could pour a lot of vinegar onto a piece of bread and then like bite into it, and that was okay. So they had all these just crazy ways of making sure that they were holy, that they were following the law. And this was supposed to be a day that God had designed for rest here, So one, we have the rest that this man was trying to get. He was trying to get a rest of following superstitions. He was trying to find healing and recovery in something that wasn't working for him, his own solutions. He had his own solutions for these complicated problems. And then there were other people, the Pharisees, who were trying to find rest in their rules. If I do all of these things, I will be good. And Jesus wants to offer us, and this is your first fill-in, Jesus wants to offer us true rest. True rest. The rest of a child who is at peace, living within the boundaries that are set by their parents. And we're going to come back to this in the end because I think we see a little bit more of this in the last story that we're going to cover. So just keep that in mind, that idea that Jesus wants us to have true rest. Okay, we're going to move on to John 6, verses 1 through 21. And I am not going to read all of this. Well, you know what? I think I will. Okay. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. That is the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. Again, this is the second one. The first one was on the Sabbath. This one is near the Passover. So John is wanting us to understand the context of Passover for this. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he had already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish." So imagine this is like 5 crackers and 2 sardines. So really not a full lunch, just like really, really small. Barley is like the cheapest grain at the time. Like this was a peasant's meal. 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many? Jesus said, "Had the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. So that doesn't count the women and children. So a lot of people. So probably 10 to 12,000 people were there at least. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Go and gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus had performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who has come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to the mountain by himself. And then a couple verses later, I want to touch on this because I want to talk about the bread before we get into the next thing. They asked him, "What sign will you give that we may see it and believe you? What will you do?" "Our ancestors ate manna in the wilderness, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." "Sir," they said, "always give us this bread." Then Jesus declared, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." Okay, so I want you to notice a couple things in this passage. So the first thing is the idea of bread, okay? So in our culture, and especially, in the last I would say my lifetime, 40 years, unfortunately, bread has become like the enemy of life. we think bread is like carbs are the enemy. We don't love bread anymore. I love bread. But in this culture, bread was actually like one of the main sources of sustenance and food in the world. So if you went over to somebody's house, the main part of your meal that you would eat would be bread. There was not a ton of vegetables. There were not a ton of meat. And so mainly what you would do was eat bread. And so bread became kind of synonymous with life. It was the source of sustenance for most of the people at this time. The other thing is that breaking bread together, because it was, kind of the source of life, was a true sign of friendship. So if you asked someone to eat with you, it was like almost a formal invitation that they were going to be your friend, that you guys were going to have a bond and a relationship together. And the final thing I want you to notice is that breaking bread was the sign of a covenant. So if you made a covenant or an agreement with somebody, you would eat together. You would break bread and you would eat together. And that was a formal declaration of the bond that you had. Now, the people, when they heard of bread, when Jesus said, I am the bread of life, there are a couple things that they probably would have thought of. So one, it's Passover. So they would have thought of the unleavened bread that they were eating during Passover time. That was a sign, and a remembrance of their rescue from Egypt. The second thing that they would have thought of was the showbread. So there was showbread in the temple, which I just think is beautiful. I shared the story that one of my earliest memories is the smell of baking bread, or the smell of baking bread. But there actually would have been the smell of baking bread in the temple. On one of the significant parts in the temple was the table of showbread, and there were 12 freshly baked loaves of bread in the temple that were there, and that the priests would actually end up eating, but they were there, and so even the very temple of God was filled with the smell of bread, the smell of life to people. But the point that I think Jesus really is talking about in this passage, because he talks about it a little bit more explicitly here at the end where he says, I am the bread of life, is he's talking about the manna in the wilderness. So after the Passover happened, God's people got carried out into the wilderness, and they didn't have any food. They wandered there for 40 years, and for 40 years, God made bread literally fall from heaven. So manna is bread from heaven. And so it was a miraculous provision of God for his people. And this is what Jesus is referring to here, is that manna, that bread from heaven that God fed his people. I read to you that the people had asked for a sign. They asked for a sign of that bread and that sustenance from heaven. And I have 2 points from this section that I want you guys, when Jesus says, I am the bread of life, I want you guys to recognize 2 points. So we've already talked about kind of bread and its significance, but I want first for you to recognize the first point is that I am the bread of life. So Jesus is talking about not just the bread, but he is the bread that brings life. And there are 2 words that kind of signify life here. So one is bios, okay? So bios just means existence. So you can look at a plant. This is a fake plant that's behind me. It's not alive. But if it was real, it would be bios. It would be a plant that was alive. It exists. It has life. But what the word Jesus is using here is Zoe. It's a true and abundant life. One of the speakers that was talking about this that I researched, he said that his son went on a plane and, somebody served him a Coke and he apparently they must have been in first class because he put up his feet and popped open his Coke and said this is living, that's life. And it didn't mean that 2 minutes before he wasn't alive. It was he was experiencing abundance. And that is what Jesus, not that we should ride in first class and have Cokes, that's our life. But that is the kind of picture of abundance that Jesus wants. He says that we need to have this, that he is offering us this Zoe, this abundant life. And it's a life that in verse 27, he says, you should be looking for bread that doesn't spoil. Manna was the bread that fell from heaven, it actually only lasted for a day. It was another part of the miraculous, provision of this bread was that they were not allowed to collect more than 1 day's worth, except on the Sabbath they were allowed to collect 2 days worth. But it was only enough for what they could have for that day. And this taught the people of God to be dependent on Him, to trust in Him. The idea of the daily bread that God gave them enough to get through the day. And it really is a beautiful, beautiful foreshadowing of communion, because when you think about the bread of life, the way that bread gives us life is that bread has to be broken. You don't just like shove a loaf of bread into your body. You break it and then you chew it and then you digest it. And only when it's broken down into its component parts does that energy and that life come into you and give you life and energy. And that is what Jesus is that we take Him. He was broken for us, and we take Him and we absorb Him and we digest Him, and then He gives us life. But this Zoe that Jesus is offering is unlike manna and more like the bread that Jesus feeds to the 5,000. Because in verse 13, we see that Jesus fed all of the people. He gave them their daily bread. And then they went out, and in verse 13 it says, they gathered the leftover pieces and they filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. And so with this Zoe, it's no longer, the life that we have in Jesus is no longer just what we need for right then just to get by. Jesus offers us an abundance, an overflowing of life. So that's the first point. The second thing is that you'll have a fill-in for this, is that it's not that Jesus just is, I am the bread of life. Jesus is, I am the bread of life. I am the bread of life. Now, the words for I am in this section are ego, emi, or I'm probably saying them wrong. I think they're ego, ami, or something like that. But it's very emphatic. So again, we're reading a book that was written in a different language from ours. And Jesus was speaking a different language from ours. And so we know that in different languages and even different places, they use words in English that are different than ours. So some of the people that work here are from the Midwest, and they do something that just drives me crazy. So they drop to be in a lot of things. So like you would look at, this Bible needs to be closed. They drop that and they say this Bible needs closed. They just say that, or that child needs to be showered. That child needs showered. They say that, and so it's like that saying to be to them, it's unnecessary, and so for somebody to say it, it's like overemphasizing it. So that's a really lame illustration of what's happening here, but the way that Jesus is saying this is the sentence construction could have just been, he could have just said bread of life, and everyone would have understood that the I am was implied. I am the bread of life. But Jesus specifically said, ego ami. Ego ami. I am. And it's almost like he is yelling these words, I am. And the reason he's yelling these words is because these are a God claim. This is Jesus saying, using the very personal name of God that God gave to Moses. When Moses asked God, Jesus is talking about Moses a lot in this section, and he's talking about the time in the wilderness. And so when Moses first met God, he asked God, who should I say sent me? And God said, tell them, I am sent you. And even God's claim in this is a claim not just to I am a God. It is I am the only God. I am supreme. There is nothing that was before me. There never was a time that I was. There is never a time that I won't be. I am. God is above everything and in everything and over everything. God is I am. And Jesus is taking that name for God and he is applying it to himself. He is claiming to be God in this very bold and explicit statement. So that is the first thing, and we're going to talk about that more in just right now. But I am the bread of life. So I want to go back and read. Gwen's sitting right here. Did I already read the storm part? No, okay. So I'm going to read the storm part, okay? So when evening came, the disciples, so this is right after Jesus fed the 5,000. It immediately follows. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake. Then where they got into a boat and set across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind came blowing and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. So just so you know, the whole idea of I am, this isn't the first time, because we read it down in verse 35. What I just read to you is in verse 16. So the first time that Jesus uses this construction of words is actually in the story of the boat. So just imagine the scene of these disciples, okay? So we know from other books of other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that the men in these boats, that Jesus' disciples, that at least a large number of them were actually fishermen. And so you have a boat full of fishermen in the storm, in a storm. And this is a scary experience, but it's not an unusual experience. There are a lot of storms on the Sea of Galilee, and these are fishermen. And so they would have been experienced in a storm. That's why when the storm came up, they didn't turn around and head back to shore. They kept charging on through the storm. And so they were probably a little bit afraid in the storm, and they probably knew that it was a dangerous situation, but they kept on going. They had rowed 3 to 4 miles in the storm, and they were battling the storm. And then out of this storm comes Jesus. And it doesn't say that Jesus was running through the storm like he was trying to get through it as fast as he could. And then you think, okay, in a storm, there's got to be waves coming everywhere. And Jesus wasn't he wasn't climbing over the waves. He wasn't tripping. He wasn't getting hit by waves. So I just imagine in the middle of this raging sea, this path of calmness, and Jesus is just walking through the storm. And he gets to the boat, and the word is actually terrified. He gets to the boat, and the disciples are terrified. They are not afraid of the storm. It doesn't say they're afraid of the storm, but they are terrified of Jesus. And so when Jesus gets to the boat, he comes to the boat, and he says, "Ego ami," I am, and then he says, "Fear not." So we read it, and it says, he says, "It is I, don't be afraid." But the exact statement is, "I am, fear not." I am, fear not. And this is also something new. Jesus is just breaking every stereotype or every imagining that they had of God. Because in the Old Testament, and it wasn't a stereotype, it was something God had cultivated. When he said, "I am," when he came to Moses in the burning bush, he said, "I am, take off your shoes. This is holy ground." When he came to the Israelites at Mount Sinai, the mountain caught on fire, and he said, "This is a holy place. Cover your face, make yourselves holy, sprinkle with blood, come and approach me because I am." But Jesus comes to his disciples in the storm and he says, "I am, fear not, fear not." And so what this means for us today is that Jesus is not just the Lord and the commander of the storm. He is the guide, and he is our mentor in the storm. Our storms, every single one of us, Jesus does not promise us that our lives are not going to have storm. In fact, he promises the opposite. He says we will have trouble in this life. But our storms are going to show us where we try to control our lives. Sometimes God lets us experience the storm so that we can learn. Sometimes he calms the storms. Sometimes he shows us how to get through it. He doesn't just calm it right away, but he shows us how to get through it. And I love this statement, is that I think it was Elizabeth Elliot. He suffered, not that we wouldn't suffer, but that when we suffer, that we would become like him. He's out to help us become who we are supposed to be. And so now we're going to wrap up with the story in verse 8, or chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. And we're going to come back to the law, and we're going to come back to rest. So this is our last feast and our last holiday. And we think this is the Feast of Tabernacles. And it would have reminded the Jews of their desert wanderings, which was the time when they actually received the law from God. So chapter 8, verses 1 through 11, or 2, we'll start with 2. At dawn, Jesus, he's back in Jerusalem. He appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. And in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." Now, I want you to notice a couple things here as well. So the Jewish leaders, we've skipped over a lot of like the dialogue that's happened, but the Jewish leaders are now in direct conflict with Jesus. They are looking for a way to trap him. In the last couple verses, they've actually looked for a way to already arrest him. So they want Jesus. They want to discredit him. They want him out of the picture. They are in direct conflict with him. And so what they're trying to do here is they're trying to trap him and discredit him. So in order to be stoned for adultery, you have to have a couple things. So it actually did not happen a lot because it was very, very difficult to actually, in the court of law, prove that somebody was actually in adultery. So you actually had to catch a man and a woman. You had to catch them in the act of adultery. So you had to actually catch them in the act. And it had to be witnessed by 2 or more people. And so it was very uncommon. So the law was while this is an extreme punishment, the law was also very, very explicit and very, very difficult to fulfill in this aspect. And so when it says that they brought this woman and she had been caught in the act of adultery, this passage is not trying to say that she wasn't guilty and that she deserved to be let go. She was guilty. She had broken the law. And so the leaders, this was like a once in a lifetime chance for them that they could trap Jesus in this because they had this very, very unusual circumstance. And so basically what they were saying was that Jesus could either uphold the law and he could condemn this woman who deserved to be condemned. She had broken the law. It was proven. There was no getting out of it. He could uphold the law, or he could basically break the law and let her go free. And everybody loved him because he was merciful and he healed people and he forgave people and he did all of that stuff. And so they thought this would undermine his appeal with the crowds. So either way, he was either going to break the law or he was going to lose his fame with the crowds. And so that was kind of the setup that they set for him. But Jesus's response is obviously, like everything else Jesus does, something we can learn from. It's poise and it's power under control. He doesn't get flustered. And honestly, sometimes silence just makes people feel so uncomfortable. A lot of people make a big deal about what he wrote on the sand. It really doesn't matter. I think he was just doodling to kind of waste time and give these Pharisees a chance to have their consciences work on him. Because when he says, if anyone is without sin, they can cast the first stone. Now, that was actually not something in the law that it meant that you had to be completely sinless to stone somebody or to carry out, the law. So that would mean you could have a serial killer, running around and killing people. And as long, if you were a liar, you couldn't, put them in prison or you couldn't, execute righteous judgment on them. That wasn't what the law was saying. But there were some specific rules about this law as well. And one was that if you were going to stone someone for adultery, you couldn't be an adulterer yourself. So that was one thing. And you'll notice that a lot of the men left, the older ones first. But the other side of this is that when you were carrying out the law, that you couldn't show partiality. You couldn't show favoritism. You couldn't favor one person over the other. Do you notice who's missing from this scene? There's one person that's missing from this scene. There's this phrase that says it takes two to tango. If they caught this woman in the act of adultery, if they caught her in the act, that meant that there was a man present too. And the man wasn't present in this scene. And so what that means is that every single person that had brought this woman to Jesus to try to trap him was actually guilty of favoritism, that they had let the man go free. They only wanted the woman to be the one that was caught. And so Jesus, right there, all he had to do was just wait for them to recognize that they too had gotten themselves caught in the law, that they were not worthy of stoning this woman. And so they left, and the only person that was actually able to throw a stone at the woman was Christ. And he looked at her and he said, I'm not going to condemn you. I'm going to let you go free. And I told you guys we were going to come back to rest and we were going to come back to the law. And I want to talk a little bit about these religious leaders, and because they remind me a lot of us. They set up all of these rules so that they could convince themselves of their righteousness, so that they could actually rest in the law. They thought that if we can make all of these rules, then we can say, okay, I've earned my way to God. I've gotten myself close enough to God that I can rest. But the problem is that the law, rest is not something that the law was ever designed to bring to us. The law is the opposite of rest. The law was designed, God gave us the law to show us our sin. The law is like a mirror, okay? So if you think about a mirror is great for showing you when you have food on your face, or you've got a booger in your nose, or you've got something. That is what a mirror is great for. But you can't wash your face with a mirror. A mirror won't wash your face. And that's what these guys were trying to do, is they were trying to use this mirror, the law, as something that would cleanse them. And it was never designed to do that. The law was meant to reveal our need for a Savior. The law shows us the greatness that we were made for. It shows us God's greatness, and then it shows us how far we are from it. Jesus gives the woman the same instruction that he gave the lame man in the beginning. He says, go and stop sinning. Go and stop sinning. She was a sinner. The lame man in the beginning was a sinner. We are sinners. They got off the hook. But the law was not abolished. Jesus does not break the law in this passage. That debt still needed to be paid. And Jesus took their punishment, and he took our punishment, and he paid the price himself. And because of this, they could, and we can, truly rest. We can truly rest in his sacrifice. We can have Zoe, that real and abundant, this is living kind of life. But the pathway to this is through the hard work of repentance. We need to recognize what we are working and what we are striving for. That the things that we're trusting in, for the angels to stir the water, for the rules that we've surrounded ourselves by to convince ourselves that we are good people, that those things, that they are equally false. False, false, false. That the basis of our rest is his work, not our work. And that we need to repent not just of our sins, but we need to be repentant of our good deeds, the things that we do to try to get ourselves closer to God. You don't find God by living a perfect life, because he's not lost, you are. You're the one that's lost. And all that you have to do to find him is to look up and look around, and you will find him standing right there in front of you. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for these ladies. I thank you for your word, and I thank you for your rest. That all of our striving, all of our struggles, all of the turmoil, all the storms, that they are answered in you. that you get into the boat with us, that you show us how to live, how we can have Zoe, that we can have true life, that we can eat and be satisfied, and that we can find our peace in you. We love you, Father, and we ask these things in your name. Amen. Have a great time in your discussions, ladies.